It is one of the most exhaustively retold chapters in modern history. A king, a woman, a crown left on a table. To the rest of the world, the story is complete. A romantic, deeply dramatic tale of a man who had everything and chose to give it all up for love. There is one detail that tends to get left out. Queen Elizabeth II, who reigned for 70 years, was known for her patience, her restraint, her almost supernatural capacity to endure without complaint. Yet she never truly closed the distance between herself and the uncle who had changed the course of her life. There was no open conflict between them, no lingering bitterness. Instead, she maintained a quiet, permanent detachment that no passage of time ever softened. The question historians have quietly circled for nearly 90 years is not the one most people assume it to be. It is not why Edward left. It is why Elizabeth, a woman not given to holding grudges, never truly let him back in. To understand that, you have to begin somewhere most accounts of this story never go. Not with Wallis Simpson, not with the abdication itself, but with what Edward VIII actually believed about himself and what the people closest to him privately believed about him. Those two things were very different. By the time Edward ascended the throne in January 1936, he had spent 2 decades as Prince of Wales, accumulating the kind of public adoration most monarchs never see. He was charismatic in ways his father, the reserved and formal George V, had never been. He connected with ordinary people. He visited working-class communities in Wales and the industrial north, expressed what seemed like genuine concern for veterans and the unemployed, and projected a vision of monarchy that felt genuinely modern. Some of those who encountered him in private found a man capable of warmth and real loyalty, not the cartoon of selfishness the darkest accounts of his reign tend to produce. His instinct that the monarchy needed to evolve was not the instinct of a fool. The institution he inherited was deeply formal, deeply conservative, and resistant to the idea that the world had changed around it. So when the establishment eventually pushed back against him, the romantic version of the story was always waiting to be written. A modern king blocked by a rigid old guard, choosing love over a crown that valued rules more than people. Millions believed it. Some still do. The romanticized version of the abdication requires ignoring a much darker reality. Long before Wallis Simpson became a public scandal, Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin had been watching the new king with growing alarm. Not because Edward was modern, but because he was careless in ways that had nothing to do with vision or ideology. State papers were left unread for days. Official advice was acknowledged and immediately ignored. Private conversations were held with foreign officials that no constitutional monarch should have been having. Those around the king documented a consistent pattern. A man who loved the ceremony of kingship, but found its actual obligations tedious. This was not a reformer blocked by reactionaries. This was a man who loved being a king, but did not particularly want to do the job of being one. Wallis Simpson did not create that problem. She simply made it impossible to keep pretending the problem did not exist. Some historians push back on this portrait, and the argument deserves a hearing. The case against Edward's character was shaped, in part, by people with reasons to justify what amounted to a forced removal. Baldwin and the palace establishment wanted Edward gone. It is not unreasonable to ask how much of the evidence against him was constructed after the decision had already been made. That argument cannot survive the next layer of the story. In October 1937, a year after the abdication, the Duke and Duchess of Windsor traveled to Nazi Germany on what was billed as a study tour of workers' housing and industrial conditions. They were received with full ceremony. They met senior officials. On the 22nd of October at Berchtesgaden, Edward met personally with Adolf Hitler. The British government was not informed in advance. In documents that remained classified for decades, the concern deepened considerably. German diplomatic cables from 1940, when France had fallen and Britain stood largely alone, describe conversations in which Edward expressed sympathy for a negotiated peace and discussed positioning him as a figurehead for a settlement that would have meant, in practical terms, British capitulation. Historians continue to debate how literally to read all of this. Some argue the cables reflect Nazi wishful thinking more than Edward's genuine intentions. What is not debated is that Winston Churchill found it necessary to send Edward a direct and forceful communication about his conduct, and that British intelligence monitored his movements throughout this period. The concerns were real. They were taken seriously at the highest levels of government. What matters most is not the geopolitical question of how sympathetic Edward actually was. It is something simpler and far more personal. While Edward managed his comfortable distance from the war in the Bahamas, George VI was in London, standing in the rubble of a bombed Buckingham Palace, visiting streets where ordinary people had lost everything, projecting the symbolic composure the crown existed to provide. Not because he had chosen this role, not because he was built for it, because someone had to, and he was the one who had stayed. That contrast is not incidental to the story. It is the story. Consider what December 1936 had actually looked like, not as constitutional history, but as a human experience inside that family. George had spent months watching the crisis unfold, still hoping some resolution might be found that did not require him to become king. When that hope disappeared, he faced a reality he had to absorb in a matter of days. A new title, a new home, children whose futures had been permanently altered without their consent. His wife, the future Queen Mother, would later describe the abdication as the most devastating event ever to strike their family. Not because she doubted her husband's abilities, but because she could already see exactly what it was going to ask of him. She was right. The asking never stopped. While his brother managed his exile, George VI guided Britain through its most dangerous years, while his own health deteriorated quietly beneath the surface. By 1948, he required major surgery for a blocked artery. By 1951, lung cancer had claimed his left lung. When he died in February 1952, at just 56, the reality was legible to anyone who had watched those 16 years up close. George VI had been worn down by the weight of a crown that was never supposed to be his, placed on his shoulders the moment his brother chose to set it down. Elizabeth watched all of it. She watched her father, a man who had not wanted this life, accept it without complaint and carry it without relief. She watched the surgeries and the slow decline. She watched a good man age faster than he should have, under the weight of something that had been handed to him the way you hand someone a problem you no longer want to deal with. When he was gone, she picked up what remained. She became queen at 25 and did not stop for 70 years. Every Commonwealth tour, every state visit, every crisis managed, every personal feeling suppressed, in service of an institution she had been pointed toward since the age of 10, when an afternoon in December 1936 rewrote her life without asking her permission. Before the abdication, she was third in line to the throne. The reasonable expectation was that she would be a respected royal figure, but not the central one, that she might have something resembling a private life. After December 1936, that was gone. For 3.5 decades, while that weight was being redistributed and carried and eventually passed to her, Edward was in exile, nursing his grievances and shaping his narrative. He published a memoir in 1951, while his brother was still alive and still king, a self-justifying account that those inside the palace found deeply objectionable. He continued campaigning, through various channels, for Wallis to be given the title Her Royal Highness. He gave interviews. He maintained with remarkable consistency the posture of a man who had suffered greatly and wished the world to understand exactly how much. He was not quietly and gracefully absent. He was present on the margins, a constant reminder, not of love sacrificed, but of a man still focused primarily on what the story had cost him. There is a profound irony at the heart of all this. The people who actually paid the highest price for the abdication never told their side of the story at all. George VI never wrote a defensive memoir or granted interviews detailing the toll of inheriting a broken institution. He left no public record of what it felt like to stand in bombed streets while his brother's name leaked into German diplomatic cables. He chose silence. Elizabeth inherited that exact same stoicism. For 70 years, her refusal to comment publicly on her uncle remained ironclad. No emotional interviews about how December 1936 upended her childhood. No public response to Edward's media campaigns. No complaints about the lifetime of obligation forced upon her. Her silence was total. What filled that silence, what has always filled it, was Edward's version of events. For 35 years, the public devoured the Duke of Windsor's memoirs and wept over his tragic love story, entirely unaware of the reality behind the palace gates. That George VI had quietly carried the physical weight of that choice until it broke his health, that Elizabeth was now left carrying it after him. The man who bore the least of the consequences had the most freedom to shape how those consequences were remembered. The people who bore the greatest weight were the most constrained from speaking. George, by the dignity of his office, and then by death. Elizabeth, by the constitutional reality that a reigning monarch cannot publicly condemn a former one without damaging the very institution she exists to protect. This is the hidden mechanism inside the story. Not a conspiracy, not a formal cover-up, the quiet, structural way that power determines whose account of events survives. When Edward died in May 1972, the Queen arranged for his body to be brought back to Britain. There was a funeral at Windsor. The Duchess of Windsor came to London and was received briefly at Buckingham Palace, one of the very few times she had ever been inside those walls. It was handled with precision and dignity. It was not warm. It was not a reconciliation. It was a conclusion. The final entry in a chapter that had never, for those inside the family, been the romantic story the public always believed it was. So why did Elizabeth never forgive him? Not for the abdication alone. Not even primarily for the wartime conduct. For the decades of evidence that followed, the memoir, the interviews, the grievances maintained from exile, the persistent demonstration that Edward VIII, faced with the reality of what his choices had cost the people around him, remained, to the very end, the protagonist of his own story. There is no document in which Elizabeth condemns him. No private letter has surfaced. No account from a trusted aide in which she finally said what the evidence suggests she felt. She was too disciplined for that, too committed to the institution, too aware that some things, once said aloud, cannot be unsaid. So she said nothing, and she showed everything. Duty, where he had chosen desire. Service, where he had chosen escape. 70 years of unbroken commitment to a role she had never asked for, built inside the space his leaving had created. Every year of her reign was, in some quiet and unremarked way, the answer to a question her uncle had posed in December 1936. He had asked whether it had to be him. She spent her entire life demonstrating that someone had to answer yes, and that someone was not going to be her father's brother. The real reason Elizabeth never truly forgave Edward VIII was not because he chose love over duty. It was because she spent 70 years living with consequences he never fully acknowledged, watching the people she loved most carry what he had set down, then carrying it herself, without complaint and without confession, for as long as she lived. Edward spent the rest of his life telling the world what the abdication had cost him. Elizabeth spent the rest of hers proving that someone else had paid. Tell me in the comments which detail changed the way you see this story. I read every single comment. Subscribe to Palace Whispers. Every story is connected, and the next thread is already being pulled.